Joseph Gamboa, 41 years old, 16 years on death row. Gamboa was convicted in the fatal shooting of a 72-year-old man and a 54-year-old man while burglarizing a business. Christopher Jackson, 39 years old, 16 years on death row. Jackson was convicted in the fatal shooting of a man whose vehicle he had just stolen. Richard Tabler, 45 years old, 16 years on death row. Tabler was convicted in the shooting deaths of two men. Dylan Carter, 45 years old, 17 years on death row. Carter was convicted in the murder of an 89-year-old man during a robbery. Stephen Long, 52 years old, 17 years on death row. Long was convicted in the essay and strangulation of an 11-year-old girl. Ramiro Gonzalez, 41 years old, 17 years on death row. Gonzalez was convicted in the shooting death of an 18-year-old woman during the course of committing or attempting to commit aggravated essay, kidnapping, and robbery. Joe Luna, 44 years old, 17 years on death row. Luna was convicted in the choking death of a 21-year-old man while burglarizing his home. James Calvert, 50 years old, 8 years on death row. Calvert was convicted in the murder of his ex-wife. After the murder, he kidnapped his 4-year-old son and fled the state. Paul Hall, 30 years old, 8 years on death row. Hall was convicted in the murder of a 68-year-old man in his garage. The man's wife was also stabbed but survived her injuries. Eric Williams, 56 years old, 9 years on death row. Williams was convicted in the murder of Cynthia McClelland, the Kaufman County DA's wife, during a burglary. He was also charged but not tried in the murders of District Attorney Mike McClelland and Prosecutor Mark Hass. Stephen Thomas, 65 years old, 9 years on death row. Thomas was convicted in the murder of a 73-year-old woman in her home. Brian Suniga, 44 years old, 9 years on death row. Suniga was convicted in the shooting death of a 26-year-old man during a robbery at a restaurant. Harlem Lewis III, 32 years old, 9 years on death row. Lewis was convicted in the shooting deaths of a police officer and a local store owner. Fidencio Valdez, 44 years old, 9 years on death row. Valdez was convicted in the shooting death of a man during a drug deal. Cedric Ricks, 49 years old, 9 years on death row. Ricks was convicted in the stabbing death of his girlfriend and her 8-year-old son. Jeffrey Prevost, 64 years old, 9 years on death row. Prevost was convicted in the murders of a woman and her 20-year-old son. Juan Balderas, 37 years old, 9 years on death row. Balderas was convicted in a gang-related shooting. George Curry, 57 years old, 9 years on death row. Curry was convicted in the shooting death of a Popeyes restaurant employee during a robbery. James Harris Jr., 64 years old, 10 years on death row. Harris was convicted in the stabbing death of a man during a home invasion. Matthew Johnson, 48 years old, 10 years on death row. Johnson was convicted in the murder of a gas station employee during a robbery. Franklin Davis, 41 years old, 10 years on death row. Davis was convicted in the murder of a 16-year-old girl who had accused him of SA. Obel Cruz Garcia, 56 years old, 10 years on death row. Cruz Garcia was convicted in the murder of a 7-year-old. Naim Muhammad, 44 years old, 10 years on death row. Muhammad was convicted in the drownings of his 2 children. Willie Jenkins, 70 years old, 10 years on death row. Jenkins was convicted of essaying and murdering a 20-year-old woman in her home. Micah Brown, 44 years old, 10 years on death row. Brown was convicted in the shooting death of his ex-wife while she was in her car with their 2 children. Bartholomew Granger, 53 years old, 10 years on death row. Granger was convicted in the shooting death of a bystander while he was retaliating against and intending to kill his daughter's mother for serving as a witness in an SA case against him. Ricky Cummings, 34 years old, 11 years on death row. Cummings and co-defendant Albert Love Jr. were convicted in the murders of 2 men sitting in a vehicle. Stephen Nelson, 36 years old, 11 years on death row. Nelson was convicted in the murder of a pastor during a church robbery. Tyrone Cade, 51 years old, 11 years on death row. Cade was convicted in the stabbing deaths of his girlfriend and her daughter. Roderick Harris, 39 years old, 11 years on death row. Harris was convicted in the shooting death of a man during a robbery. Kimberly Cargill, 57 years old, 11 years on death row. Cargill was convicted in the murder of a woman who was set to testify against her in a child protective case. Kwame Rockwell, 48 years old, 11 years on death row. Rockwell and 2 other men were convicted in the shooting deaths of 2 men during a convenience store robbery. Jamie Cole, 53 years old, 12 years on death row. Cole was convicted in the shooting deaths of his wife and 15-year-old stepdaughter. Tederick Batiste, 36 years old, 12 years on death row. He was convicted in the shooting death of a man during a carjacking. Joseph Jean, 51 years old, 12 years on death row. He was convicted in the murders of 2 girls ages 16 and 17. Arely Escobar, 44 years old, 12 years on death row. Escobar was convicted in the essay and stabbing death of a 17-year-old girl. Travis Mullis, 37 years old, 12 years on death row. Mullis was convicted in the murder of his 3-month-old son. Courtney Robinson, 33 years old, 12 years on death row. Robinson was convicted in the shooting death of an 82-year-old man during a robbery. Mark Gonzalez, 48 years old, 7 years on death row. Gonzalez was convicted in the shooting death of Bexar County Sheriff Sergeant Kenneth Van. Van was shot more than 25 times with an AR-15. Demond Blunson, 54 years old, 7 years on death row. Blunson was convicted in the shooting deaths of his 21-month-old son and his girlfriend's 6-year-old boy. Amos Wells III, 33 years old, 7 years on death row. Wells was convicted in the shooting deaths of his 22-year-old pregnant girlfriend, her 10-year-old brother, and her mother in Fort Worth. John Falk, 57 years old, 6 years on death row. Falk was convicted in the death of a correctional officer during an attempted prison escape. Susan Canfield was struck by a vehicle stolen by Falk's co-defendant while trying to stop the escape. Billy Tracy, 46 years old, 6 years on death row. Tracy was convicted in the fatal beating of prison guard Timothy Davison at the Barry Telford unit. William Hudson, 41 years old, 6 years on death row. Hudson was convicted in the murders of 6 people on a camping trip. The victims' ages ranged from 6 to 76. Jason De La Cerda, 46 years old, 5 years on death row. De La Cerda was convicted in the murder of his girlfriend's 4-year-old daughter. Isidro de la Cruz, 33 years old, 5 years on death row. He was convicted in the death of his ex-girlfriend's 5-year-old daughter, whose throat was cut during a home invasion. Ali Irsan, 66 years old, 5 years on death row. Irsan was convicted in the honor killings of his son-in-law and daughter's best friend. The state said the deaths were part of a plot to kill 5 people, including his daughter, after she left home, converted to Christianity, and married a Christian man. Dillian Compton, 29 years old, 5 years on death row. Compton was convicted in the beating death of a prison guard, Marianne Johnson, at an Abilene prison. Howard Lewis, 56 years old, 5 years on death row. Lewis was convicted in the hanging death of his 16-month-old son. The child was found at the house of his grandmother, who was also killed. Christopher Love, 39 years old, 5 years on death row. Love was convicted as the hired gunman in the death of a Dallas dentist. Gary Green, 60 years old, 4 years on death row. Green was convicted in the shooting death of an Upton County Sheriff's deputy after authorities approached him at a gas station. Ronald Haskell, 43 years old, 4 years on death row. Haskell was convicted in the shooting deaths of his ex-sister and brother-in-law in Spring. He also admitted to fatally shooting 4 of the couple's children, ages 4 to 13 years old. Hector Acosta, 34 years old, 4 years on death row. Acosta was convicted in the slayings and mutilation of 2 people, one of whom was beheaded. Damian Mosley, 42 years old, 4 years on death row. Mosley was convicted in the shooting death of a gas station clerk in Tyler during an armed robbery. Gustavo Sandoval, 40 years old, 4 years on death row. Tijerina Sandoval and the co-defendant were convicted in the shooting death of an off-duty U.S. Border Patrol agent. Brandon McCall, 32 years old, 3 years on death row. McCall was convicted in the shooting death of a Richardson police officer responding to a shooting at the apartment where McCall was staying. Lucky Ward, 59 years old, 3 years on death row. He was convicted in 2 separate fatal stranglings of women in Houston. Otis McCain, 38 years old, 2 years on death row. McCain was convicted in the shooting death of San Antonio police detective Benjamin Marconi after approaching the detective's parked patrol vehicle. William Davis, 39 years old, 2 years on death row. Davis was convicted in the deaths of 4 people at a Tyler hospital. He was found guilty of injecting air into patients' arterial systems while he was a nurse. Tyrone Williams, 37 years old, 2 years on death row. Williams was convicted in the fatal stabbings of 2 women after breaking into their home. Robert Solis, 51 years old, 1 year on death row. Solis was convicted in the shooting death of Harris County's first 6th Sheriff's Deputy, Sandeep Dhaliwal, during a traffic stop. Taylor Parker, 31 years old, 1 year on death row. Parker was convicted in the death of Reagan Simmons Hancock after cutting out her unborn baby, who also died. Robert Satterfield, 42 years old, 6 months on death row. Satterfield was convicted in the shooting death of 4-year-old Ray Hudson Jr. He was also charged with killing the boy's parents, Maya Rivera and Ray Hudson Sr. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.